And I usually let it stay on this screen.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I know it's always nice to follow up a kind of visionary conversation with one about accountability, so I get to be a nice counterpoint to what you just discussed. And actually, the accountability results are largely a good story as well, but I'm going to walk you through what accountability has looked like for ELs, and then at the end we'll talk about some demographic shifts and some of the performance measures that we've talked about in prior years. But excited to be with you. As Katie noted, Evan Kramer worked on data governance and accountability at the department. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for the opportunity to chat with you this morning. So we'll start by outlining our objectives for the time that we have together. I'll review accountability for schools at a high level, and then we'll spend additional time on English learner accountability, looking specifically at the subgroup for ELs and also looking at the English language proficiency indicator itself. We'll also spend some time, as I mentioned, looking at demographic and performance data. This is the time in the presentation when typically I'll pull out these charts and you'll say, how do I get that from my school? And I say, I don't have permission to give you those data, so just wanted to preview that that's the conversation we'll have at the end of this presentation. Still working to get permission to share those data with you. There is a quiz at the end, I should mention. It's a group quiz, so I'm going to be having you shout answers at me, but I want to prepare you now so that you're ready. So here are our 3 objectives for the time that we'll spend together this morning. So the first is you should be able, when you leave this room or when you're done with my session, to describe what goes into school accountability, at what weight, and roughly how those calculations proceed. Especially for the English language proficiency indicator, which I know you care about an additional amount. Also, we should be able to explain how English learners are included as a subgroup in accountability, and some places where there might be either inconsistencies or things we want to note or flag as we consider that EL subgroup. And then finally, you'll have an opportunity to evaluate trends in EL performance and demographics toward the end of the presentation. So let's start with what English proficiency looks like in school accountability before we talk about the EL subgroup as a whole. So I'm going to start with the framework at a high level, because when I tell you about this indicator and don't tell you about the whole framework, it's sort of like me telling you about a classroom without you knowing what the school looks like. So let's go through that at a high level, and then we'll dig into the indicator itself. So the first thing we do in school accountability is we identify priority schools. And those priority schools are schools in the bottom 5% statewide in terms of achievement that don't show consistent high growth. So we identify these schools once every 3 years. We use their performance on TNReady to determine priority schools. And again, there is a safe harbor, so if schools are showing high growth in the 2 most recent years, we don't consider them priority schools. So that's at a high level the first step in school accountability. And then once we've identified priority schools, we assign scores from 0 through 4 for each additional indicator in the framework. So we've got achievement, growth, we have chronically out of school, we have English language proficiency, we've got 2 high school measures, which are graduation rate and ready graduate. You may have seen some version of this. You may have seen maybe a press release or a presentation we've given, or some one-pager or FAQ that lists this. But this is the framework at a high level. Those are the indicators that we evaluate when we come up with a school's score. And what you'll note is that English language proficiency is included in there, and that's a really exciting opportunity. For students with limited English proficiency, their performance on TNReady doesn't tell us what they actually know and can do. The English language proficiency exam, as you all know, is a much better assessment in terms of the growth that they're making year over year. We're excited to have the opportunity with new federal law to include this measure in accountability, and so we've done a lot of work to make sure that this measure is appropriately included for all schools as possible. So once we've evaluated all of those indicators, we do that both for all students as a group, and then for historically underserved groups of students as well. So if a student is an English learner, that student counts both in the all students group and in the subgroup that he or she is applicable, that applies to that student as well. So we'll note that those students are deliberately counted multiple times because their performance matters. These are students we want to make sure are receiving the services they need. We'll talk more about how those students are included a little later on. So that's the framework at a high level. If you don't remember all this, that's okay. There are 2 pieces that we're going to focus on specifically. Again, we're going to dig into that English language proficiency indicator itself, how it's calculated, what it actually measures, and what it checks. I'll be honest, that's the bulk of the quiz that's coming for you, so that's a special place to pay attention. And then again, we'll talk about that English learner subgroup specifically, who's included, how, and what it looks like within the overall framework. So let's start with this indicator. When we talk about the English Language Proficiency Indicator or the ELPA indicator, we're actually measuring students' progress in acquiring the English language and becoming fluent in the English language. We're not looking necessarily at the percent of students who exit, we're looking at are they making adequate progress year over year. And as you know, adequate progress looks different depending on what the student's proficiency level is. Right? The more advanced a student is in terms of their language acquisition, the more difficult it is to continue growing at that same pace. We'll talk about how we define those growth standards, but at a high level, this is a quiz question. The English Language Proficiency Indicator measures whether students are making adequate progress in terms of acquiring the English language. And so we say meet growth standards or make adequate progress. This is what we mean. So this table comes out of our 2018 accountability protocol. And what you see we've done is we've bucketed students' prior year scores into half-point increments. And we've set up a growth standard that matches those prior performance levels. So historically, if you're familiar with the way we've done sort of Title III accountability before we had the opportunity to bring it into Title I, you're used to that 0.7 of a point uniform growth standard. Right? And you may have wondered why 0.7 of a point. We partnered with researchers, we determined that this was sort of a suitable level of growth, and the only problem is that that might be reasonable for certain students, but for students with high levels of proficiency, that's actually a really difficult mark to attain. So what you see here is that scores are actually mapped on to the 60th percentile of growth for those score bands. So if you're not a math person, or math is a little more of a struggle for you, let's break that down into what this would look like. So for students who scored in 2017 between 1 and 1.4 on their composite performance level, the 60th percentile, or the point at which 60% of students scored below that mark in terms of growth, was 1.3 points composite improvement. What that means is they're doing slightly better than average. We wanted to be aspirational in setting these goals, right? Just hitting the average isn't all that difficult, right? Half of people are doing it and half are not. But if we set those targets a little bit higher, what we've seen is that you all, as the commissioner noted, have risen to those expectations. And actually our EL performance and our ELPA indicator has done really well in school accountability this year. So excited to release those results to schools, as we noted on Friday. So that's what those numbers represent. It wasn't just me sitting in a room thinking of these things and pulling them out of thin air. This represents data that students have attained, right? Based on their prior performance, how did they do the next year? And again, let me just hammer home the point as to why this matters. So the horizontal green line you see on your screen, or barely see on your screen, is 0.7 of a point. That's the uniform growth standard that we used to expect. The height of the bar here is the average growth based on the prior score. And across the x-axis, you see the individual composite score that students earned in the prior year. So again, the height of that line is the average score for students at that performance level, which is mapped across the x-axis. So if we maintain that 0.7 of a point growth standard, what we would be doing is we'd be saying for students who score in the prior year, roughly 2.1 or lower on their composite score, they're basically guaranteed to meet growth standards. And what that means from a school accountability standpoint is if you're in elementary school, you're significantly advantaged. If you're a high school, you're disadvantaged. What we've done instead is, again, adjust those growth standards based on students' prior performance. Now what we see is there's no association between whether you're in elementary school and high school in terms of how well you do on that English language proficiency indicator. There's no correlation. This is an exciting development. It means that your schools are actually meaningfully differentiated in terms of what you're doing. Obviously, there are high schools that way exceed that growth standard, the percent of students meeting that growth standard. There are high schools that fall below it. But now it doesn't matter what kind of school you are, it matters how well you're serving your students, which is an exciting change in our framework. Let's talk about this indicator a little bit more and what it actually consists of. So again, the ELPA indicator is measuring the percent of students who meet those differentiated growth standards that we defined. I'm going to go through what that actually means, some of the business rules we apply, and then the weighting that's relative to that indicator as we think about that whole system. The first thing to note is that we do 3 checks to determine whether a student made adequate progress in learning English. The first check is a 1-year check. So based on those standards I put up a couple slides ago, did the student meet that 1-year growth standard? So the student scored 1.2 last year. Are they a 2.5 or higher this year? That's the first simple check that we do. The second check is a 2-year check. So what if the student made tremendous progress 2 years ago, but in the most recent year, they actually didn't make that much progress? They grew 2 points in terms of their composite performance, but last year they stayed the same. If that's the case, then we'll still count them as having met the growth standard, assuming that over that 2-year period, when we combine the 2 years of expected growth, that the growth that they actually maintained over the course of time exceeded the amount they were expected to grow. Again, this is an exciting opportunity. When someone first introduced this thought to us, I said to myself, I doubt this is really going to pick up that many more students. It's probably not the case that you have tremendous growth 1 year and then you fall the next year. But actually, we pick up about between 5 and 15% more students when we do this. This is a meaningful shift, and so we're really looking to say, let's have a long-term view of the performance of English learners. We know that you all can't change students' proficiency in English in 1 year. You can't do it. It's not a realistic expectation. So we want to take a longer view and say, are you setting this student up to integrate into mainstream curriculum, to receive the instruction that you know they deserve, with a longer view of the wider lens? So that's why we do that 2-year check. And then the third check we do as part of this ALPA indicator is to see whether a student actually met the exit criteria. The ultimate goal is to get the student to a place where they're proficient enough to access the content that they deserve. And so a student might actually not make the growth standard in 1 year because their proficiency level is so high and so close, but they could exit that year. So a student who exits ESL services but doesn't meet the growth standard for that 1 year would also count in accountability as having met the growth standard. So those are the 3 checks we've done. It's gotten to a point, I used to give these presentations, right, and someone would come up at the end and they would say, well, have you thought of this? This is one check you should be doing. It's gotten to the point where now we do these presentations and fewer people are saying, hey, you're totally missing something. So I feel like we're getting closer to the universe of checks that we should be doing. But we welcome your feedback here in terms of how students are being captured in the system. So again, those are the 3 checks that we do. We do a 1-year check, a 2-year check, and we check to see whether students exited ESL services. So let me talk a couple of business rules about this indicator, because I know that when you think of this indicator, you're actually thinking of students, right? You're thinking of your buildings and how this looks from the standpoint of the students you serve. So a couple of business rules that are worth noting. Time to wake up. A couple of business rules that are worth noting. The first is that most indicators in our framework have a minimum number of students that we require of 30. If we held that number of 30 for our English language proficiency indicator, no surprise to you all, we wouldn't have the opportunity to showcase the good work you're doing in terms of English proficiency specifically. Most schools don't have 30 English learners who took the WIDA access exam in the current and prior year. What we did was we lowered that minimum count to 10 at the school level, with the reason being that we wanted to show the complementary growth you're seeing on ELPA as sort of a counterpoint to TN Ready performance. And so by lowering that N size, we've increased visibility, increased the opportunity for you all to showcase the good work that you're doing with EL specifically, who are still receiving services. That's the first important business rule to know. So the big impact of lowering the N size or the minimum count to 10 is that it's no longer prudent to set AMO targets. And let me take a brief detour to describe AMO targets for those who aren't familiar. So AMO stands for Annual Measurable Objective Targets. What we're doing roughly is we're looking to reduce the percent of students who are not meeting the standard. So we're trying to cut that in half over 8 years. And what the AMO targets are set to do is to provide an opportunity for schools, regardless of what percentage of students are meeting the standard, to improve and to be rewarded for that improvement. The only problem is that if you have only 10 students in the prior and current year, and that's your minimum size, well, you can have a significant difference in which 10 students, someone really took the wake up call, right? You can have a significant difference in those 10 students, so you might have 6 of those students change out wholesale, right? And so the majority of that indicator or that target would be set on students who are either no longer in your school, who may have exited, or who represent somehow different performance than the students that you're expecting for this year. And what that means is that an AMO target in this instance is actually not reasonable, it's not defensible, and so it would put you all in a place where your AMO target might be out of reach, it might be too easy, but because of that small size, the fluctuation in the population, that target isn't really a prudent measure. And so most of our indicators allow for schools to meet the standard based on improving based on targets or through their absolute performance. For the English language proficiency indicator, part of the trade-off of increasing visibility by lowering that minimum count is also the trade-off of not being able to set AMO targets responsibly. That's just a little bit about why we've made that business rule decision. So I mentioned briefly how this looks in the whole framework, but I want to talk about its weighting in terms of that overall score. So this indicator is worth 10% of a school's overall score. That's true both for our pool of schools that serve grades K through 8, and also schools that have a graduation cohort as well. If a school does not have 10 English learners who take the WIDA Access exam and earn valid tests in the current and prior year, then we take that 10% weight and we redistribute it evenly to achievement and growth and just increase them by 5 percentage points. It's worth noting what it means when we say a valid test. That's a term we use a lot in accountability. When you hear valid test for WIDA Access, all that means is that we have a valid performance level for a student's composite score, that they have sufficient data across sufficient domains to be able to compute a composite score. As long as that's the case, and as long as they took the assessment that corresponded to the cluster and grade level that is appropriate for them, then they have a valid composite score, and we consider that an included student in that test. Just a quick reminder of the weights here. So I mentioned the 6 indicators that are included for high schools and the 4 for K-8 schools. Again, here's the overall picture. So as a reminder, if a school doesn't have those 10 valid tests in the current and prior year, then that 10% weight for ELPA would get split 5% each and added to achievement and growth. I've thrown a lot of information at you, so let's summarize just at a high level what the methodology contains and also the indicator itself. As we noted, the first step in our accountability framework for schools is to identify priority schools, which we do once every 3 years. Those schools are the lowest 5% based on test performance. Schools that have high growth are exempted from that designation. And then once we've identified priority schools, then we go about providing overall scores for each school that reflect the multiple indicators we mentioned. And with regards to the English language proficiency indicators specifically, we're again measuring the percent of students who meet growth standards. We're only including active L's and W's here, obviously. And we do 3 checks to determine whether a student met those growth standards. We do a 1-year check, a 2-year check, and a check to see whether students exited. Again, we lowered the minimum required count of students to 10 to increase visibility in this indicator for schools. By reducing that minimum size, we also don't have targets as a trade-off. So I've thrown a lot of information at you. Let me pause here and see if you all have any questions. Yes, please.
I was, our accountability department at the beginning of last year, so may have changed,
Sure.
said that the exited students, transition year 1 and 2, and their performance on 10 ready was part of what was going into the ELPA calculation. Is that incorrect?
It is not incorrect, but that's referencing district accountability. I
Gotcha.
specifically left district accountability out of this.
So it is calculated differently for the district and for the school?
It is, yep. So the question was, I heard that the performance of students who recently transitioned out of ESL services, that counts towards the English language proficiency indicator. What I'm not telling you right now is there's a district accountability framework, and that has some other nuances to it. And in district accountability, that English language proficiency indicator, one of the ways we measure how much value a district is adding is whether the percent of transitional ELs who are acquiring proficiency or mastery on the TN Ready exam, whether that percentage is increasing and increasing at a greater rate than the state. So that's a much more sort of nuanced explanation than you may have wanted. It was not incorrect what your accountability department said. That's just why you may have heard that in your districts. We've got 2 over there, so I'll let you do get out as to who gets to go first.
Could you explain why at the level of,
I was just wondering if you could explain, I know that 10 is the minimum in the school.
Yes.
If you have 10 in a school of 750, they still count 10%, but in larger schools you may have 100 of 750. Couldn't there be some sliding schedule depending on what percentage of the total population they make up instead of the 10%?
We thought, it's a good question, we thought about a sliding scale, and it wasn't clear that it was totally within the confines of the law. But the reason being is that all indicators have to be weighted the same for each school, and the removal of one indicator can't significantly change a school's rating. And so it wasn't clear that that provision in the law could be met with a sliding scale. So what I didn't mention is that the all students performance that you saw compared to the student groups performance, the all students performance is weighted at 60%, student groups weighted at 40%, and that roughly maps on to the representation in our state of students who are in one of those accountability subgroups. So we've tried to use sort of a state average as a proxy, but it doesn't totally get at the point you're making. And what we would say is that you're right, it's not necessarily responsive to school level populations. Although we do certainly want to apply significant pressure in this area because we know it's a group of students that we want to prioritize in terms of their growth. And we want to reward largely, as the Commissioner noted, the great work that you all are doing. So the sliding scale, to summarize, was not clear whether it was totally legal, and so what we did to try and combat that was to have a standard approach which said, what's the rough representation of these subgroup populations throughout the state?
Okay, I have two questions. The first one, is there an expected growth for students who are on the alt access, where we have, like, depending on the score, and in conjunction with that one, do those students count towards the N size, that number of 10?
No and no. So we don't currently use alt access data because there really aren't sufficient numbers of students in each school. We're looking at a way to include them and to aggregate both alt and non, but we don't currently have a good way of doing that given the small number of students that we have.
Okay, my other question.
Sure.
How are we taking into consideration students who are dual served? They have special education and IEP.
Yeah.
That's going to affect their growth on the access. How are we taking that into consideration?
We're not necessarily adjusting growth expectations for them. We can't make those growth expectations responsive to every student characteristic. And we can't, for example, set targets for students with disabilities within our framework at a different level, because that would be out of compliance with the law. And so you're right that it represents a challenge for duly identified students as to how to serve them best. We just, federally speaking, we don't have the leeway to make a different target for a student who has a disability because it would be representing a different standard for that student. But that's a case where I would certainly defer to our program area to say, what are the kinds of supports that you all feel you need, and are there ways for us to be prudent in the way we measure those things? So we're constrained, obviously, in terms of what we can do, but if there are supports that you need or there are ways that you think you'd like to measure that in a complementary way, we'd definitely be open to that feedback as well. Yes?
If you have students that come in that do not have a match score from the previous year, but they exit, are they still counted in your exit number, or have they been already eliminated from the students that are looked at for not having a match score?
It's a great question. If they don't have a prior year composite, then we don't look at them as counting in the number of students who exit. They have to have a prior year composite score. The other thing to note is if a student earned a composite score in another district, not another state, but another district, we can use those data to compute growth year over year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that the student earned a composite score in your own district for us to be able to compute growth for that year. Anything else? Sorry, Joseph, we're making you run all over tonight. It's like they coordinated it. They decided who was going to ask, and so like a star pattern. That's right. Yep, that's right. Get prepared.
What about a student that comes from their RETA state? If they have a score in their RETA state, we can't pull that?
We don't have access to those data.
Okay.
It's a good question. It would be nice, though. Something about privacy laws, etc. Any other questions? Yes? Okay.
Hello. I just want to back up and get specific information on what the contact will be for those services, the disabled students that we need. You know, you said you have opportunity to share support with us. That score was 30% of our score. So I need to know how to, who to have contact with.
Sure, I don't totally understand your question, but I will say that the program area in terms of Jan and Katie can support you in terms of thinking through how yours.
Well, it was the one where
And Joanne,
you
and
said
support
we
services.
can't change the targets for disabled students, but you offer
Correct.
support. And I just want to know where that
Understood.
support is.
Yes, so Joanne, Katie, and Jan are all excellent resources in terms of thinking through how your students who are duly identified, how their scores look in your data, and then thinking through what supports they would require in order to be successful. So they can certainly help you with that. Okay. Joseph, you have a way in the back.
I just want to clarify, you said that even though a student is waived, we are still held accountable for the data and for the 10%? Is that correct?
Students who waive services are included. Yeah, they're federally required to test, and so they're included in
Even though parents have waived the right to ESL services, we've conferenced with them, we've encouraged them, we are still held accountable for them. That's correct?
We are required to do so. Yeah, we must include them based on the law. Okay. The number of murmurings has increased, so clearly we've struck a nerve at some point. Right, between duly identified and I think we're... So we'll take one more question, then we'll go on, Joseph, so we'll give you a break.
I promise I did not plan that, Joseph. Just you were talking about if you have a suggestion on how we might be able to...
Hold on, my brain is small and I'm struggling to hear you. If you could stop your table conversations just for a moment, that would help me. Thank you. Go ahead.
So you mentioned if you have a suggestion on how we might be able to denote the kiddos that are dual served.
Yes.
And this could be one that's already come up, I'm sure. But would it be, you were talking about how you had come up with this, using the prior year and then seeing what the expected growth would be based on about a 60%. Is it possible, since we do know these kiddos that are dual served, couldn't a new scale be made for them, for ELPA, for the kiddos that are dual served? So if we just looked at those kids, now that we've had access for a few years, we could determine where that 60% would be based on time.
So I think it's a good thought. It's one we consider. The issue that's not totally clear is that doesn't fall totally in line with the federal law, because we'd be setting different standards for students based on that feature, based on their disability status, and that could get us into trouble in terms of our federal compliance. We can use some other factors to determine an expected growth standard, but we'd have to apply them uniformly, and it's not clear that we can do so here, right? So we'd have to, I think we'll talk about it as a side, but it's not clear that we could totally comply with federal law and do that as sort of an adjustment to growth standards. It's a good thought, though. And there are certainly other factors, too, right? Disability status is one reason why students might have a lower expected level of growth, or why a lower level of growth is reasonable for that student. But you can imagine that a student's native language proficiency matters, that their time or that interruptions to their formal schooling matters. I think the question is just how do we calibrate our expectations based on all of those, and we're still looking at what might be the most prudent way to do that. Okay, thank you for all your good questions. I'm going to move on to how school accountability reflects the English learner subgroup. And we'll talk about what that looks like as a whole, and then we'll go through demographic and performance data. So when we think about English learners in school accountability, we're looking at that student group score. That student group score is again worth 40% of the school's overall average. So again, 60% for all students, which does include ELs, and then 40% additional, that includes students who pertain to any one of those subgroups. So again, those duly identified students, they count in your students with disability subgroup and your EL subgroup as well. Assuming you're eligible for all subgroups, each of those 4 subgroups counts evenly in that 40%. Again, ELs are one of 4 subgroups that we consider in accountability. So the other 3 are a group of Black, Hispanic, Native American students. We combine that group not because we're making some statement about racial continuity or anything like that. We're really just trying to make sure that we're focusing on students who have historically been underserved in our system. Economically disadvantaged students are the second group that we consider in accountability. English learners, obviously, and then students with disabilities. So again, If a student is in every single one of those subgroups, then that student would count multiple times. We know that. We know it's a source of friction with districts at some times. We also do know that the spirit of the law is one that is a civil rights law, and we do know that your focus on these students can largely be rewarded in terms of counting these students multiple times. So that ELPA indicator, if a student is Hispanic with a disability and an EL, then that student counts multiple times, and we know from our data that you all are doing really great things with English learners. We want to reward that by counting these students multiple times, and also certainly to incentivize the continued growth of these areas. I noted here just how this composition of that 40% would look depending on which subgroups are eligible. It might be that you're eligible for one subgroup and not another within that group of 4, so just wanted to note that those compositions could change based on how many students you had in each subgroup. I also wanted to note that subgroup performance and subgroup eligibility could vary across indicators and across subgroups. So as an example, you might have an English learner subgroup that's eligible for the ELPA indicator because we've got fewer numbers of students that we're looking at. And it could also be eligible for the chronically out of school indicator. Right? We're just looking for 30 students in your school in that instance to see whether they're chronically absent and improving. But you might not have students in sufficient numbers who took the TNTESOL exam in order to be eligible for the achievement indicator or the growth indicator. So this is a bit nuanced, but I did just want to present that there are cases where a school could have a subgroup eligible in certain indicators but not others, based on the individual eligibility requirements of those specific indicators. As we noted, the ELPA indicator obviously includes only those active students receiving services and waiving services as required by law. Now that said, we actually do include transitional students up through transitional 4 students in the EL subgroup overall. So when we're thinking about the performance of your EL subgroup in, say, chronically absent, those are students who may not be receiving services directly, but who could be part of the transitional group. We have an opportunity now under the federal law to include those transitional students, whereas previously it had been really difficult to include the minimal measures. And actually, one of the best measures of how a district or a school is doing with regards to its ELs is how students who have exited services are continuing to perform. At the state level, we see that students who are transitioning out of ESL services actually outperform our native English students. That's across all subjects, not just math, also ELA. What that means is that you all are providing a really strong foundation for these students such that when they're exiting the services that you're providing, that they're actually surpassing their peers who are native English speakers. That to me is really impressive. That's one of the features that's not only compelling in and of itself, but it's also compelling in that we've seen it for multiple years now. We thought this was a fantastic finding when we first found it a handful of years ago, and it's continued to be the case. It hasn't stopped being true. That's really important. It talks about the sustained work that you all are doing and can continue to support as well. Questions about how English learners are counted in school accountability before we go on to some brief demographic and performance highlights? I see one over there.
So transition students are hopefully accountable within the common absenteeism, is that correct?
They're also accountable, so the question was, transitional students, are they included in all indicators? They're included in every indicator except the ELPA indicator, because they don't actually take that exam, but they'd be included in achievement, growth, chronically out of school, graduation rate, ready graduate, anything we can find. Yes?
Seeing data that ranks the English learner subgroup further down into subgroups, like I guess on the ELPA indicator, if there are any, like you don't have just the ELs and we'll see Hispanics, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, is there a way that those further broken down subgroups is playing into the accountability for us?
So the question was, I see EL often broken into multiple subgroups. How are those other multiple subgroups included in accountability? And the answer is that it really depends. So the Hispanic subgroup is not included on its own in accountability, but Hispanic students are included as part of the Black, Hispanic, Native American combined subgroup that we use. The other thing to note is there are subgroups in some of our data where we pull out English learners separately from transitional English learners, students who aren't receiving services but have exited. And when we think about accountability for schools, for every indicator other than ELPA, as we noted, those transitional students are included always. And so we don't break it down into English learners who are receiving services and English learners who are no longer receiving services. So for the purposes of school accountability, every indicator but English language proficiency includes all ELs who are transitional or actively receiving remaining services. Does that answer your question? Maybe. Okay, we can touch base afterwards if I didn't answer it. Good. Any others? Okay, let's talk demographic and performance data, since I know these are the highlights that you all like to see too, and the pretty pictures are something that we always enjoy going through with you all. So I'll start by sort of reviewing what our makeup of ELs looks like in terms of grades, and I'll then go into talking about native languages, distribution geographically, but I want to note something really important. I pulled these data last night at 10 o'clock. It's still possible that you all have not entered data at your districts for English learners. And so if you see declines, we shouldn't necessarily take that to mean that we have fewer English learners in a given grade. We should take that to mean that perhaps data haven't been entered yet for your district or for your school. So wanted to put that caveat out there before we make any conclusions about how our population is changing dramatically. So as of 10 o'clock last night, here is what the data look like. You'll see that still what's true is that the majority of students who are ELs, and you see both active ELs here and are receiving or waiting services, and you also see transitional students here. The majority of ELs we serve in our state are in our earlier grades. And what you all are doing is great work. You're exiting them by middle school largely, but you also get a blip of students in grade 9 too. And the way we explain that blip, or have seen that blip be explained to us, is that you get a lot of students who are sort of late in their academic career in high school. They perhaps had limited sort of formal education in their home country. They come to you all, and it doesn't feel like 11th grade is the right placement for them, even though age-wise that's where they belong. And so that's why we see that blip in grade 9. It's not necessarily that there's something else happening in grade 9, but that's sort of what the explanation has been for the data that we've seen. Just to break down what you're looking at, so the blue bars that you see on the top of that compilation, those are active L students. And then going down the scale in color, so green are your students who waive services. And then gray, orange, dark gray, and that sort of tan color, those are 1, 2, 3s, and 4s, respectively. So those are our transitional students. And again, the takeaway here, right, is that by grade 5, a significant percentage of the students who are English learners for the purposes of accountability are transitioning out of the program. This has been pretty consistent year over year, but it is an exciting thing for sure. Let me show you something that will surprise you to no one. Our ELs tend, as a percentage of the total student body, tend to be clustered in districts that are closer to major metropolitan areas. Not always the case, but that does tend to be true and has continued to be true. One interesting finding, or perhaps I was just in a sleep-deprived stupor, one interesting finding to me last night was that actually the percent of students whose native language is Spanish has continued to decrease year over year. I didn't provide multiple year snapshots here, but actually the number of folks whose native language is listed as Spanish in the data that I pulled was decreasing relative to the number of students who listed their native, or districts who listed students' native language as Arabic. So the decrease in Spanish as a native language has been pretty consistent over the past couple of years too. And now for the graphs that I know you're going to ask me to give you a copy of that have your district labeled, and so let me just preface that. So these graphs represent growth performance in terms of WIDA access. These are one-year growth patterns. I didn't include, actually that's not true, this does include those 3 checks I mentioned. And this is a distribution. So across the x-axis is every eligible district. I broke it out by district because school is just a little bit too much information. And what you see is there's a tremendous variation in terms of the percent of students who are meeting those growth standards when we do those 3 checks. The horizontal bar here is the average line. It was just about 50% in terms of the percent of students who were meeting growth standards. This whole graph has continued to go up, right? So the rising sea levels have continued to be the case. When we started doing this at first, I think our average across the state was about 42% of students meeting growth standards. Now granted, we've provided some additional checks to make sure students are meeting growth standards, but this again speaks to sort of the rising tide that we're all feeling, lifting all of these boats. So growth performance does vary significantly across district. And I tried to break this out by region. It turned into a total technicolor mess. But we'd be happy to provide these visuals at a very high level for your districts, and I'll connect with our program area to make sure they have the resources they need to publish those, if you wanted to say see your district highlighted relative to the rest of the spectrum. But there's also significant variation in exit rates, and we consider exit rates less in accountability. Now it's just sort of one of the checks that we do at the end, but we used to be really focused on these students exiting ESL services. So what you see here is the horizontal green line here is the average across the state in terms of the percent of students who exited. That average has again continued to tick up, less so than our growth targets, or excuse me, percent of students meeting growth targets, but it has continued to increase. And the thing that's more interesting to me here, and would be curious to get your perspectives, is that the gradient toward the upper end gets really steep. So whereas the growth graph, you see sort of moderate change across, right? Actually, the steeper side is on the bottom end of the distribution. When you look at the distribution of districts who are exiting students, there's a really steep gradient toward the right side of what you're looking at, which means that there's significant difference in sort of the tail end of districts getting students to exit. There could be a number of explanations for that. One could be small population sizes, and so it could just be that the districts who are doing well, sort of on the right side of the graph, have really small percentages or numbers of EL students, and so that is what explains those steeper trends. That could be the case. It could be that those districts are serving fundamentally different groups of students who come in, so it could be that they're getting students who are already significantly advanced in their language acquisition. So it could be some sort of different composition of the group that they serve. But I present these just as sort of an interesting finding to see what explains why we're coming so close to that 100%. Obviously, the steepness reflects that there are districts that exit every one of their eligible students, right? So that's part of what the steepness is, and our overall average of exiting students is relatively low, so that explains part of the steepness. But what it does tell us is that for one reason or another, whether it's the students they serve or whether it's the programs that they're delivering, there are districts who are doing really well in this area. And so the question that we ask is, what can we learn from them? What lessons can be applied to other districts? And what perhaps is an unfair comparison to the work that other districts are doing? Questions about anything you've seen in those tracks? Okay, so let me wrap up, and again, the quiz is coming, so be prepared. The first thing that we'll do is just make sure that we accomplished and outlined the objectives that we had at the outset. So the first thing we said we would do is we describe what components, what weights, and what calculations go into this English language proficiency indicator. We'll quiz you on that in a moment, just to remind you sort of what we're expecting. We'll also explain how English learners are included in accountability specifically, so not just the ALPA indicator, but also the subgroup of ELs. And then third, this is less on the quiz, hopefully you should have the opportunity to evaluate sort of what are the trends in the data that we see and what might explain those trends. Are we looking at fundamentally different groups of students, or is there perhaps some different services that students are receiving? So the quiz starts now. Hold up on your fingers the number of percentage points that the ALPA indicator counts toward overall accountability scores. Many people already have the right answer. If you're struggling to find it, look around your table. One of our people is putting their hands at you. Yes, 10%. You got it. So what's, same way of responding, what's the minimum number of students you have to have in the current and prior year in order to be included for the ALPA indicator? You didn't even have to move, right? You could have just left your hands right there. You have 10 students. Again, valid performance level, valid composite level in the current and prior year. You got it. When we say valid test, this is a stretch question. Again, we're looking for those non-missing composite levels. Let's work there. What happens to the weight of that ALPA indicator, that 10%? What happens to it if we don't have 10 students in the current and prior year? 5 growth, 5 achievements. Now you have to split your hands. 5% each, stack them up. This is a little trickier to respond in your hands, so I'm actually just going to look for you to call out in a moment. What are we actually measuring with the ALPA indicator? Absolutely, we're measuring growth. Now, exit is a component, but we're measuring whether students are meeting growth standards in terms of acquiring English proficiency. There are 3 checks that we do in the ALPA indicator. What is the first check that we do to see whether students meet growth standards? 1 year. What's the second check we do? 2 years. What's the third check we do? Perfect. It's like a chorus, I love it. Those are the 3 checks we do. If there's a check we're missing, come find me afterwards so we can put it in the framework. I have a feeling we get skewered on that one later, so it's good. In terms of which students are actually included in the EL subgroup, there are 6 codes that we consider as part of the English learner subgroup. What are they? You all are rock stars. LW, T1 through T4. Are transitional students included in the ALPA indicator? Here's a stretch question. Why not? Because they don't test on meet access. You all are experts. Why are there no AMO targets for the ALPA indicator? This one's a little trickier, so I'll actually take a volunteer for this one, because otherwise it's going to get really messy.
N equals 10.
Yes, your hand went up first.
Did you drop the N size from 30 to 10?
We did do that. Now, here's another stretch question. Why is dropping the N size from 30 to 10, why does that make it irresponsible to create AMO targets? Well, let me finish. I'm going to put you on the spot. Why does dropping that size, why is it now not a good idea to create AMO targets? That's fair. Someone can help you out up here. Too few students, right? So my population could change significantly. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot. There's another note that I should make there, and this is again for those who just want to see sort of more of what's going on behind the scenes. If we ever change our exit criteria, which you'll hear more about today, if we set targets based on a percent of students who have exited on old criteria, then we're always comparing apples to oranges. And we know that we've had some inconsistency in terms of how WEDA standards have been relative to what we expect students to know and integrating them into mainstream curriculum. And so not having AMO targets actually allows us some significant flexibility in resetting exit standards or making policy decisions, for example. So that's another reason why we have chosen not to have AMO targets as well. Okay, you're done with the quiz. You all passed. Excellent work. Want to make sure that I do 2 things. I'm going to pause for questions and feedback or reflections in a moment. You will get a copy of this presentation. I'll make sure that you all have it to send out. There's a link to a survey. We'd love your feedback not only on the ALPA indicator, ELs and accountability, but would also love your feedback on how we can make this presentation more usable for you, for your districts, and for your teachers. Just want to thank you again for the opportunity to be with you, and I will stick around for questions if we have them. So thanks. Any questions? Sure.
Usually when it pops up, then I stop this. Okay, you can click stop.
Just wondering if you